Welcome, and thank you very much for coming. I'm Professor Nancy Horowitz. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight. This is the second talk in this year's Elie Wiesel Memorial Lecture series. Our theme this year is Co-Witnessing and Social Justice, Our Responses to Humanitarian Crises. Professor Timothy Snyder delivered the first talk 2 weeks ago, giving a very impassioned and clear analysis of the war in Ukraine as genocide. Professor Irene Kacandes' talk is in some ways an extension and refocusing of some of the issues that we heard about in Professor Snyder's talk, as she's going to address our role as witnesses to the trauma of others. How can we frame our responses to ethical crises? Our moderator this evening is Dr. Ingrid Anderson. She is the Associate Director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and she specializes in trauma studies as well as Jewish philosophy and theology, among other areas of interest. We will be taking your questions on cards right after the talk is over. Do you all have cards and pencils? Just nod. Okay, we'll pass them out. So we will answer your questions through a moderated discussion that Ingrid's going to be moderating. So Ingrid, please.
Kacandes holds a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. At the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, as part of a fellowship, she researched a project entitled Who Will Witness for the Witness? A reevaluation of co-witnessing. Her research and teaching has long engaged general as well as academic audiences. A prolific scholar and an expert on the Holocaust and traumatic memory, she is the author of Talk Fiction, Literature and Talk Explosion, Daddy's War, Greek-American Stories, and with Steve Gordon, Let's Talk About Death, asking the questions that profoundly change how we live and die, among many other publications, including Teaching the Representation of the Holocaust, co-edited with Marianne Hirsch, edited on being adjacent to historical violence, and co-edited another book, Eastern Europe Unmapped, Beyond Borders and Peripheries. This fall, Kacandes has begun a new transatlantic venture in order to bring the work of scholars to a wider audience. She is moderating a series of virtual and in-person conversations called Humanities for Humans. The series brings together high-profile scholars in the humanities to discuss important contemporary issues from a humanistic perspective. A big thanks to those who made this program possible, in particular, Dr. Teresa Cooney, who is the administrator of the Elie Wiesel Center, and Jeremy Solomons, our communications director. Thank you guys so much. Please join me in welcoming Professor Irene Kacandes, who will speak on co-witnessing and social justice.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Great. There is a handout that has a lot of the references that I'm going to be making tonight. So if somebody doesn't have that, maybe you could raise your hand and someone could come for it. Okay, I see one hand there in the middle. Okay, everyone else has it. Okay, great. So my huge thanks to both the director, Nancy Horowitz, and Ingrid. I'm sorry I didn't catch your last name. Anderson, is that right? Great, okay. I feel truly honored to be speaking in a series in memory of someone who was truly a giant, Elie Wiesel. And I'll come back to him before I finish my formal remarks. I need to acknowledge that today is not just the day after the American elections, but November 9th is one of the weightiest days in German history. We have mostly events that are very, very tragic, starting with what we referred to as the November pogrom. Some of you may have heard that under the name Reichskristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. but it was truly a pogrom. Some people were killed, many businesses were destroyed, many synagogues were burned or destroyed, and many, many Jewish German men were arrested. So this is clearly the most tragic event that we have on November 9th, but there are other terrible events in the year 1923, for example, when Hitler and his allies tried to overturn the government, the Hitler Putsch. So, and there are even other November 9ths, but the reason it's a particularly complicated day for Germans is that November 9th is also the day that the wall was breached in the city of Berlin, which for many people was actually a very joyous occasion. There are some people in the room, I believe, who experienced that very night. So Germany as a country decided that it could not make that the official holiday because of the tragic events, and that is October 3rd, for those of you who would like to know. This lecture being scheduled on November 9th, as far as I know, is a complete coincidence. I think the room was available, and I was available, so that's how this happened. But I do want to thank you all for being here and for taking a moment to remember those for whom November 9th is a very tragic day. So I'm going to start my formal remarks now. At the conclusion of Albert Camus' La Chute, The Fall, the first-person narrator, Jean-Baptiste Clémence, is dying at home in bed when he addresses for one last time his silent narratee. Though Clémence claims that he finally wants to hear that individual's story, say now that you are going to talk to me about yourself, he actually seems more eager to hear the narratee say through your mouth the words that for years have never ceased echoing through my nights, end of quote. Those words would rewrite Clémence's inaction when he witnessed a young woman throw herself off a bridge into the Seine and drown. Whatever existentialist message Camus might have wanted to deliver with his novel and its ending, the image of someone speaking someone else's story relates to some very hotly debated issues in our era of Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Me Too, and alas, most recently, the protracted military invasion and assault on Ukraine, something some of you have heard about from Professor Snyder at the previous Wiesel Memorial Lecture. My comments tonight will address questions like, what does it mean to be an ally? Which actions, words, attitudes are helpful in working for peace and greater social justice? Where does support end and appropriation begin? I will approach answers through co-witnessing, a concept that I developed after my first serious contact with allyship and trauma theory in the early 1990s, and I've been thinking about and revising ever since. Other strains of thought that contributed to my understanding of co-witnessing include conversation analytical conceptions of storytelling as co-construction, psychotherapeutic treatments of trauma that assign a critical role to the therapist to enable stories of trauma to come into being, and cultural memories, studies, versions of testimony. I've used my colleague Marianne Hirsch's idea of post-memory in verbal form, post-remembering, as a kind of kindred concept. I'm inspired also by Paul Ricoeur's concept of the prochain, the neighbor. So my portrait of the co-witness includes the following characteristics. The co-witness is usually someone who is not present at the infliction of a crime or injustice, or is present but not the direct target of that violence. The co-witness has a desire to think about others, to listen respectfully to their stories when they're able to recite them themselves, or to help research them and learn the details and complexities of their stories when the targets of the violence or injustice cannot speak for themselves. The co-witness passes on other stories without appropriating them or claiming victimhood. Please notice that this description is meant to cover two basic scenarios. One, when the targets of violence and injustice are able to speak for themselves, in which case the role of the co-witness concerns supporting victims by repeating their stories to additional listeners and potential allies. and one in which individuals or groups have experienced a trauma or other injustice, and because of that traumatization, or by virtue of being incarcerated or being dead, cannot pass it on themselves, and therefore it will only become known if a co-witness does so. Both scenarios run the risk of appropriation. As disability scholar Amy Schumann warns, making the claim to speak on behalf of others is always a precarious claim, open to the challenge of misinterpretation and misappropriation, end of quote. With regard to this danger, I'd like you to note how I write the term itself. It's important to me that the co and the hyphen work to signal caution around appropriation of others' stories. I think of this hyphen as a little bulwark, a deterrent to adopting the victim position, an activity that perhaps is a particularly prevalent American tendency. It certainly has been amplified through the megaphone of the self-proclaimed victim of everything, perpetrator of nothing, also known as the 45th President of the United States. Did he take the victim script from the President of the Russian Federation, or was it the other way around? I don't know. I have expanded and refined my concept of co-witnessing by looking for it in three discursive domains: prose fiction, non-fictional genres such as memoir or documentary film, and personal accounts in news reports or informal oral recitals. I started thinking about co-witnessing in the first place because of some aspects of prose fiction that intrigued me for what wasn't being said explicitly. I sought answers in a conception of trauma as an event that can't be integrated into stored experience, and that therefore the traumatized individual is incapable of narrating what happened. In this approach to trauma, and there are others, healing might occur because a therapist or other sympathetic listener serves as a blank screen or midwife, enabling that event or to be transformed into a narrative after all, the story of the trauma, so to speak. In using this understanding of trauma to read prose fiction, I observed that readers might detect missing events, traumatic symptoms, or untold narratives at several levels. At the story level, inflictions of violence or injustice can be depicted, as can characters who are able or not able, or willing or not willing, to co-witness to those inflictions. I call this interpersonal co-witnessing, when two characters co-witness to a trauma or injustice suffered by one of them, and surrogate co-witnessing, when two or more characters co-witness to each other about a third character's trauma. That's all at the level of the story. At the level of the literary discourse, a reader might observe features like gaps, limited perspective, mixed up chronology, flashbacks or repetitions, and interpret them as some kind of textual equivalence of traumatic symptoms like blackouts, social isolation, reenactments, or flashbacks. Of course, I don't mean a personification that the text itself is actually traumatized, but rather that the author might be creating a story which as a whole depicts characters or society in a state of traumatization, a situation in which certain stories simply can't come into being in part or in full. When a reader comes to this conclusion, I call it textual co-witnessing, since they deduce that through the literary text. With regard to the extra-textual level of the history of a specific work of prose fiction, a reader might do research about how that text was written, published or not published at completion, received or not received by the author's contemporary readers. I label such an account historico-social co-witnessing. This might include remarking the absence of certain kinds of stories in the public sphere as a sign of a traumatized society and co-witnessing to that. The activity of the reader that draws such a conclusion, as with the activity of outlining what's going on at all the other levels I've just mentioned, belongs to something I've designated transcultural, transhistorical co-witnessing, because it's produced by someone outside the culture or living and reading at a time later than the original production and reception of a given text. Now, I do realize this sounds a little bit abstract and complex, but I believe that a brief look at Gertrude Kolmar's A Jewish Mother, and I can finally thank Abby Gilman, who's here, Abby, you told me about this text. I don't know if you remember that, but it's a long time ago. Okay. This book was written in 1930, 1931 in what was still called the Weimar Republic of Germany. And it was first published by her sister Hilda under the title A Mother in 1965. This is Gertrud Kolmar, who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. Okay. The novel's plot concerns a young Jewish child who's abducted and raped, eventually located by her frantic mother, who, in complete despair, assumes her child will never recover, and so several days later administers sleeping powder that ends the child's life. The mother conducts a years-long search for the perpetrator, which fails completely through her social isolation, indeed rejection by those who help she seeks. Coming to the conclusion that she herself is the culprit, she walks into the river Spree and drowns. Now, this plot has been labeled melodramatic by many, but I believe a co-witnessing to the full text in the sense I've just described can lead to a more complex and historically and socially valuable reading. To get to such a full meaning, a reader, I in this case, needs to mention the co-witnessing or lack thereof at all the levels just articulated. The child is so young and she's so hurt in the wake of her rape that she cannot integrate and narrate the experience, and therefore readers can conclude that she's traumatized and needs a co-witness for her story to come into being. Though the child's body could be said to testify to the crime, characters like the medical personnel, other hospital patients, or her own mother can't seem to turn this kind of evidence into a narrative of the crime. So interpersonal co-witnessing fails. Similarly, when the mother is refused a hearing by those she appeals to about violence to her child, her surrogate co-witnessing is foiled also. If a reader notices certain things about the literary discourse, details like the facts that the rape scene is elided altogether, or that when the mother finds the child, the text elides what she sees when she lifts the child's dress. Further, neither characters nor the third-person narrator ever name the crime. Inside views of characters are rare. The language of the entire discourse is awkward. A case can be made for reading these features as mimicking traumatic symptoms. For instance, we could say that ellipses represent blackouts. And hence, readers can conclude that the novel is performing textual co-witnessing through those features. Further, the manuscript was not available to Kolmar's contemporaries. That is to say, we have no evidence that Kolmar tried to publish it. Some of those potential readers, I surmise, like Kolmar herself, were traumatized or perpetrators of the anti-Semitism and sexual violence in late Weimar Germany. So in my terms, there was no historico-social co-witnessing, even though at the time of the writing, there were no publishing restrictions for Jewish authors, and practically, though not psychologically speaking, Kolmar could have tried to publish it. When readers like myself, in a later era and in a different culture, learn about and remark the incomplete or failed co-witnessings at the other levels, they in essence create a narrative of all the traumata. Such an account, based on research about Kolmar in the period, could surmise that Kolmar wrote a Jewish mother because she was observing or experiencing misogyny and anti-Semitism in the society in which she lived. Reader co-witnesses might further deduce that having depicted in her manuscript ostracization, exclusion, violence against Jewish characters, the author actually feared bringing the same on herself by telling the story. And that's why she didn't try to publish what she'd just written. Her surviving sister's decision to elide the word Jewish from Kolmar's typescript title, when that sister had it published as A Mother more than 30 years later after Kolmar drafted it, seems to point to fears of anti-Semitism in the sister's post-Holocaust German-speaking Swiss world. Labeling textual features as performance of trauma could be said to involve deploying somewhat specialized narratological skills, noting, for example, scarcity of inside views, and linking them to some extra narratological knowledge about trauma and its symptoms. To carry out historico-social co-witnessing, you have to undertake historical and cultural research. Whatever the sum of the skills needed to create the transcultural, transhistorical co-witnessing account, we need to recognize that our activity changes nothing for the historical personages of dead authors or their contemporary readers, nor does it change anything that happens to fictional characters, of course. Nevertheless, I propose to you that such acts have an important social value. When co-witnesses of any period or place point to the depiction or deduced traumatization of an individual or group, and label and speak its cause as a crime or injustice, they might be adding to or correcting the historical record. And to be sure, such labeling reveals their values of what counts as a crime or injustice. In making this claim, I'm agreeing with trauma practitioners, theorists, and legal scholars like Judith Herman, Kathy Carruth, and Martha Minow. To return to the specific issue brought up by co-witnessing to Colmar's novel At All Levels, there's a way in which we could say that the trauma-inducing anti-Semitism of the late Weimar period could be thought of as unprosecuted or as somehow still wielding its power until it's named a crime by me or other reader co-witnesses. Further, as legal scholar Martha Minow in particular has so persuasively argued, when we name the victims, we show whose suffering our society cares about. In other words, our choices about to whom we will co-witness reflect, indeed, they may even determine who we actually are. Now, I assume this issue of acknowledging who the true victims in a society are will be immediately salient to all of you, where, to take just one instance from our own contemporary culture, many white Americans learned only in the wake of the murder of George Floyd about the injustices, indeed crimes, including murder, ubiquitously committed by the police against Black Americans. A few additional points follow from doing this exercise of co-witnessing to prose fiction that also apply to co-witnessing through other genres. Following trauma experts, I note that the eventual co-witnessing account produced by readers should not be confused with the traumata themselves. On a perhaps most general level, scholar Kali Tal warns us against equating representations of trauma and traumatic experience. Textual representations, literary, visual, oral, are mediated by language and do not have the impact of traumatic experience, end of quote. Sexual abuse survivor Roberta Culbertson would agree. Narrative, as simply an accounting in time of events in time, limits what can be told, indeed making the truth of body recall appear unintelligible and false because too disjointed and without context, end of quote. Noting this difference is one way we can avoid appropriating others' suffering while still co-witnessing to it. To put this otherwise, co-witnesses require a good deal of humility about what we can and cannot understand. In this regard, I found it most helpful for using Jeffrey Hartman's idea of transmitting what one has heard, literally just carrying it over, passing it on. I believe that Camus' powerful image of you saying through your mouth the words that have been echoing through my nights that I quoted at the beginning of this talk captures this idea of transmission quite effectively. Camus' protagonist doesn't want his narratee to claim his story. He wants him to articulate something he himself has not been able to say out loud. I read these lines as expressing the protagonist's hope that if his listener does speak these words, something profound will change in their ethical universe. We can deduce from the fact that he immediately withdraws his request that such a change strikes him as highly improbable. Still, this disparity in the actual experience of trauma and its representation is one reason why co-witnesses should remain tentative about conclusions whenever it is my mouth telling your story. Another reason for tentativeness is that further research or discovery of documents might add to or correct the co-witnessing narrative. To be clear about this point, while the story and the discourse of any novel or other published works of nonfiction or films is obviously set at some point, Further research might turn up information that would modify how we interpret the crimes or injustices depicted or about the work's production and reception. That is, new information might require us to change the co-witnessing narrative we create as transcultural, transhistorical co-witnesses. Now, in turning more directly to nonfiction and real-life situations, I begin with Nobel laureate Patrick Modiano's Dora Bruder, which I call a paramemoir because while it includes some personal experiences of the person whose name is on the cover, those experiences are not the main focus of the book. Dora Bruder has served me as a primer and a guide to attitudes and actions of co-witness authors. Additionally, it uses techniques like second-person address to call me as reader to join into the act of co-witnessing, perhaps by writing about it or by telling others about it, as I have in numerous classes and conference settings, and as I'm doing right now with you. For those of you who don't know Dora Bruder, let me offer a few more details. Modiano describes his attempt to establish certain facts about a Parisian Jewish girl of whose existence he first learned in 1988 by perusing a December 1941 issue of a magazine called Paris Soir, where he came across a notice reporting that a young person named Dora Bruder was missing. Now, the cover of this Spanish translation, very interestingly, tries to evoke that chance discovery of Modiano's. While part of the book, Dora Bruder, concerns Modiano's emotions around his own adolescent running away, so Dora had run away, he has run away, and his relationship to his father, a more central focus of his research efforts and of his imaginative powers involves trying to reconstruct Dora's story, to be a co-witness, in my terms, to the life of this person. To put this otherwise, the paramemoir Dora Bruder is mainly about Modiano trying to co-witness to the tragic fate of the historical person, Dora Bruder. And in doing so, the author co-witnesses to many other individuals' fates and to the crimes committed against them in Nazi-occupied France. Additionally, he makes connections between his own life and theirs. Modiano's preparation for co-witnessing involves a first critical, obvious step. You see here, je pense à Dora Bruder. I think of Dora Bruder, right? We have to step out of our own ego, right, and decide to think about someone else. His preparation for co-witnessing also includes visiting places where Dora must have passed, her home, her school, police stations, jails. He researches by hunting down documents that concern her and her family, and he consults the stories of many lives lived alongside her about whom he can often find out more information than he can about Dora. In other words, Dora's story on some level didn't exist. It had to be created, akin to the way the story of the infliction of a trauma might come into being in the presence of a psychotherapist or other supportive listener. Dora and the crimes committed against her don't enter history if Modiano doesn't discover them and we don't pass them on. Now again, Modiano's book does absolutely nothing that helps the historical person Dora Bruder, as nothing I said a few minutes ago helped the author Gertrude Kolmar. To put it bluntly, they're both long dead. But when we learn of, when we point to, when we deduce the fate of this French teenager and her family, and when we label and proclaim their murders as unjust and criminal, we might be correcting or enlarging the historical record, as Modiano enlarged what we know about occupied France. To summarize then, Modiano's book recounts many of his own acts of co-witnessing, and itself as a whole constitutes an act of transcultural, transhistorical co-witnessing, right? He's in the same culture in this sense, but he's living in a different time period. But we're not quite done. If one carries out the co-witnessing exercise to the extra-textual levels I've outlined, one should also detect lacuna in Modiano's text and investigate them and other aspects of the production and reception of Dora Bruder. In this case, doing so will uncover moments when Modiano seems to be over-identifying with Dora and appropriating her story to tell his own. Sometimes Modiano recognizes this over-identification and he points to it in his text. Readers should take note of these self-conscious moments and make them part of their co-witnessing narrative, as they should incorporate the moments when he fails to do so. One can deduce a certain amount of egotism by also scrutinizing his research process. Modiano mentions only briefly an interaction with Dora's cousin, for example, whereas the photos he analyzes in his book to discern more about her personality certainly came from that cousin, something he doesn't acknowledge but which scholars have turned up and which other would-be co-witnesses like ourselves should learn and incorporate into our acts of co-witnessing to Modiano's co-witnessing. Similarly, several Holocaust experts who gave Modiano documents to help him create a detailed narrative of what had happened to the Bruder family were outraged that Modiano did not acknowledge fully their assistance, whereas he does spend quite a few pages talking about the searches that he conducted for documents. So as co-witnesses to Modiano's book, we need to learn about, register, and point out in our co-witnessing narrative the felicitous and not so felicitous acts of co-witnessing, as I'm doing right now with you. Now, there are several other nonfiction books that I consider extremely effective acts of co-witnessing to which we in turn can co-witness, but which I regrettably only have time to list tonight. In my area of specialization, Holocaust studies, I have myself tried to co-witness to my father and his paternal family's experiences during fascist-occupied Greece. I also want to bring to your attention some other superior acts of co-witnessing to the Holocaust. Historian Ivan Jablonka's History of the Grandparents I Never Had, and the very recently published 100 Saturdays, Stella Levy and the Search for the Last World, where Michael Frank co-witnesses to the fate of the Jewish community in Rhodes, Greece. Of course, co-witnessing doesn't belong to one historical tragedy or injustice. In Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, Hazel Carby investigates the racism and classism of Great Britain by co-witnessing to the lives and ancestors of her parents. Her parents were mixed-race Jamaican, Carl Carby, and white, poor Briton, Iris Leaworthy Carby. Fintan O'Toole uses his individual and family experiences to co-witness to the traumata of his native Ireland in We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland. Taya Miles uses fabric, and particularly a fabric sack, to co-witness to slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow segregation in All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black family keepsake. To co-witness, excuse me, sorry, I do actually want to save that for a second. To co-witness the complex tragedies and their victims recounted in these kinds of books, we need to pay attention to what's in the books, but also to details of how the books were written, deploying some of the skills behind my accounts of A Jewish Mother and Dora Bruder. In co-witnessing to film, which we don't have time to do together tonight, we would want to pay attention to things like the soundtrack, camera angles, and editing to get a fuller account of what the film is co-witnessing to. Perhaps we can take this up a little bit further in the Q&A. I do have examples of that. But before I leave the topic of nonfiction books that are themselves powerful gestures of co-witnessing to which we in turn can co-witness, I want to make sure you know that the great, truly great cultural anthropologist, ethnographer, folklorist, and novelist Zora Neale Hurston interviewed at length in the late 1920s an individual named Oluwale Kosola, also known in the US as Cujo Lewis. Hurston produced a manuscript about him that she called Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, a book that I consider a profound and extended act of co-witnessing to the trauma of the, at that time, last living African brought into the United States as a slave, brought in illegally on a ship called the Clotilda after the slave trade had been officially abolished. Though Hurston finished the manuscript in 1931, her act of co-witnessing to Kosola was not published until 2018. So that's a reflection on us, you guys, as American society, whether we like it or not. The Viking press of 1931 wanted her to rewrite it into so-called standard white English, not in the dialect that Kosola actually spoke to Hurston in. I proposed that by refusing to rewrite it into some other group's English, and rather by reproducing as much as possible the organization and the manner in which Kosola narrated his life to her, Hurston was behaving as the kind of co-witness I described at the beginning of this talk. She tried to transmit someone else's story while not appropriating it as her own. And one of the ways we as readers can co-witness to Hurston and Kosola is by learning this publication history and paying attention to the language and organization. By doing so, we honor Kosola and Hurston's agency, and that too is part of the story. In this context, I want to mention the recently released movie, The Woman King, which, I note, includes fictional elements. Still, it is historically accurate in many respects, including with regard to the Dahomey and their trade in black slaves. The traumas of Kosola began with a raid by the Dahomey on his village, and he testifies to the Ogoji, the all-female warrior unit that is highlighted in this movie. Thereby, Hurston and this film are co-witness to Black-on-Black violence. As I was putting the final touches on this talk, I learned about a new documentary on the Clotilda, the ship that brought Kosola to the United States. Highlighting Hurston's act of co-witnessing in the context of this recent feature film and documentary film allows me to underscore my point that when and to which crimes we co-witness or not reflects back on who we are as a society. And further, that we is not always united in when and to whom we are willing to co-witness. Crimes and injustices reported by journalists, or even more informally by individuals who were themselves victimized or served as co-witnesses to victims, are valuable sources for stories we should pass on. You're seeing on the screen one of the first news stories I put into this co-witnessing framework. In 2004, I read an article by Alan Cowell in the New York Times reporting that South African professional pianist Tessa Uys was about to send a Blüthner grand piano that had belonged to her mother and on which Tessa had played all her life to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. This short report caught my attention and eventually turned into an act of co-witnessing on my part through additional research and then transmission of this story. Like Modiano's Dora Bruder, my co-witnessing contains an embedded act of co-witnessing, that of this daughter to her mother's trauma. Originally built in Leipzig in 1913, the piano you see pictured here had been purchased by Tessa's mother in 1930, and it was taken by her from Berlin to South Africa in 1936. In 2003, when the daughter was preparing to sell her deceased parents' home, Uys overcame her apprehension and began to examine some Nazi-era papers of her mother's that she had found in a box in the music room. Uys knew that her mother was German, but Helga Bassel, her mother, had spoken very little about it beyond recounting the grand buildings, the fascinating museums, and the lively cultural life of her native Berlin. Daughter, as potential co-witness, needed to study those papers, but to do so properly, she sought the help of experts in Berlin to whom she took the paper trail and who in turn conducted additional historical research to learn a fuller story of her mother's life. Herself born in South Africa and raised in the Dutch Reformed tradition, Uys, via her expert helpers, discovered that her mother had been born into a Jewish family in Berlin. This is something she knew nothing about. Despite Helga's conversion to Catholicism in 1933, her Christian fiancé was pressured by the Nazis to break off his engagement to her. Though she was a very talented pianist, she was expelled from the Professional Musicians Organization in 1935, effectively ending her career because she was declared fully Jewish by the Nuremberg laws. Helga and her brother Gerhard fled to South Africa in 1936 when they were tipped off by a friend of her former fiancé that much worse was on the way. In this context, Bassel's decision to take the grand piano with her can be interpreted as an act of resistance to the Nazis and their view of her. Of course, we cannot be sure exactly why Basil took the piano with her. One could argue that, like many accomplished musicians, she wanted to keep playing her own instrument. Perhaps. However, given its size and the expense and difficulty of moving it, I suspect that the reasons went deeper. From what I know about anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews in 1930s Berlin, I suggest we read Basil's act as a political, if private, response to the crimes of disenfranchisement perpetrated against her. So you see, I'm naming the crime. I'm calling it disenfranchisement, right? You'll note the similarities to my hypotheses about Gertrude Kolmar's decision to write and yet not try to publish A Jewish Mother. These are parts of my co-witnessing about which it is important for me and you to note that I might be completely wrong about. I can't be sure. I'm doing it the best job I can, right? Something we can be more certain about, because the individual spoke of it to journalists before and following the concert she gave at the British Museum on the piano, is that Tessa Uss had undertaken a series of deliberate acts that testified to a hitherto unknown persecution of her mother as a Jew in Nazi Germany. Further, once Uss learned more about her mother's past and the piano's odyssey, she thought not only to part with the piano, even though it had been central to her own life and her career in music, but also to connect it to other acts of oppression. The night before the piano was to start its journey back to Germany, Tessa called a large group of friends to her parents' home, and she played the Blüthner. She performed pieces that her mother had loved, concluding her impromptu concert with the national anthem of the then relatively new South Africa. Tessa repeated this gesture at the concert she gave at the Berlin Jewish Museum once the piano had arrived, starting and ending with that same national anthem. In other words, Uss decided to link Jewish suffering in Nazi Germany to Black and colored suffering in apartheid South Africa and the hope of a new nation state and social system there. I count these piano performances as part of her act of co-witnessing. To summarize the transposition of this set of events into my framework, through the daughter's decisions to go public with her mother's story, to donate the piano to the museum, all those who take time to learn the piano's history can use it as a way to co-witness to what happened to Basil's suffering. We need to admit that we don't know the specifics of that suffering. Helga Basil committed suicide in 1969. Was it related to those early injuries and injustices? Her daughter says no one knows. Still, by deciding to think about someone else, to learn what happened to them, to label the violators, the violence, and the violated, and to link their suffering to other suffering when we can, and it seems appropriate, we are co-witnessing. So here's another inspiring example. Retired Dutch lawyer and member of the Dutch resistance under the Nazi occupation, Henk Zanoli, the man in the middle in the back, made a different connection between mid-20th century oppression of the Jews and the present by co-witnessing to disenfranchised, besieged Palestinians. In summer 2014, Zanoli learned that an Israeli airstrike launched in the Gaza Strip had flattened a house, killing 6 of his relatives by marriage. In response to this news, Zanoli decided to return the medal and certificate that had been awarded to him and also to his mother, long deceased, by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations for actions they had taken to save Jews during World War II. Specifically, Zanoli had smuggled a Jewish boy from Amsterdam to a village where his mother successfully hid the child from 1943 to the conclusion of the war. They were both taking a huge risk, since their family had already been marked as resistors, with several members, including Zanoli's father and brother-in-law, arrested and then killed. In the letter to the Israeli ambassador in The Hague, with which he returned his medal, Zanoli stated that among the bereaved are the great-great-grandchildren of my mother. In interviews he gave to journalists the next day, Zanoli explained that, quote, I gave back my medal because I didn't agree with what the state of Israel is doing to my family and to the Palestinians on the whole. Now, believe me, I realize fully that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not only has a long history, but it has involved many different types of crimes with multiple perpetrators and victims, and sometimes individuals are both perpetrators and victims. In this sense, the Zanoli example is controversial, like my brief evocation of black-on-black violence witnessed by Casola and in turn co-witnessed by Hurston and the filmmakers, or the continued British racism and classism by Hazel Carby. I find it instructive in that in talking about what he decided to do, Zanoli was careful in his act of naming. We need to include his precision in our co-witnessing to his co-witnessing. The perpetrator he identifies is the state of Israel, not the Israeli people. Palestinian civilians who are victims of bombing attacks and the families they leave bereaved are the victims in this instance. Zanoli's precision is particularly significant given that he was very supportive of the creation of the State of Israel as a response to the Nazi Judeicide in the late 1940s. This is where specificity again becomes important. Good reasons for the founding of a country don't give it a moral pass in perpetuity. Through his actions of giving back the medal and also writing and talking about why he did that, Zanoli linked lessons learned from the Shoah with today. Zanoli's co-witnessing pointed forward too when he expressed hope for a future Israeli state, quote, with a level of righteousness on the basis of which I could accept the title of righteous among the nations, end of quote. This is parallel in my mind to Oos's playing the new South African national anthem. Mr. Zanoli could not know if his actions, if his co-witnessing would help anybody. That is, if they would result in any cessation of violence against those whom he was considering present-day victims. Nor could he know what criticisms he might unleash against himself from those who disagreed with him. But at age 91, when these events occurred, he was once again putting himself at risk to do what he thought was right. This time not by smuggling an innocent victim of Nazi anti-Semitic hate, but rather by his acts of giving back the medal and explaining why. Zanoli passed away a little more than a year later, presumably still hoping that official Israeli policies might change and that as a result, his medal might be collected one day by a younger member of his family. The kind of co-witnessing I'm promoting needs to mention all these pieces, past, present, and future. So using the past to refine one's sense of justice and injustice, and using the past as a yardstick for events in the present are ways in which I've been inspired by real people like Oos and Zanoli. And to my mind, this is an appropriate moment to mention Elie Wiesel as a witness and also a co-witness to the slaughtering of European Jewry and subsequently to other acts of genocide. Wiesel took up this role so effectively, it's easy to forget the decades-long post-war period of near complete disinterest in what had happened to the Jews of Europe. In the late 1970s, in a lecture at Northwestern University in response to Holocaust denial in the Chicago area, Wiesel was still trying to convince audiences of the importance of remembering, of co-witnessing to those millions of deaths. Quote, if they had the courage to write, he urged his audience, you must listen. You must listen to more. Now, I hope that you, like I, have been inspired by the courage of co-witnesses like Wiesel, like Daniela Fraser, who filmed the mistreatment and then murder of George Floyd by the police, like Greta Thunberg, who staged her one-girl protest in front of the Swedish Parliament building, like the founders of Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of the acquittal of the killer of Trayvon Martin. Here's someone you might not have heard of, Kolani Nkosi Johnson, a South African AIDS activist who died at age 12, weighing less than 20 pounds. And here are his words. Do all you can with what you have, in the time you have, in the place you are. What can I do with all that I have in this time and place? I can take action within the scope of my talents and resources, for instance, in giving talks like this one, or publishing a book that assembles more than 30 acts of co-witnessing to historical violence. Of course, as a teacher, one has a privileged setup for learning about past injustices and then taking action in the form of transmitting co-witnessing narratives. The two recent iterations of a course I've been teaching for decades on responses to the Nazi past occurred during the Trump administration, and the very latest in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. The necessity to connect issues from my area of historical expertise to current events made itself felt frequently and urgently. My final lecture in the spring 2019 course introduced the concept of co-witnessing to my students. Through their reactions to that lecture and to the course in general, I came to feel that there was one very obvious thing missing, extending the concept to make it even more relevant to what they would be facing after they left my classroom. When I thought about what I wanted to say to my students with regard to their and our collective futures, I realized I wanted them to not only learn others' stories and transmit what they had learned to yet others, important actions to be sure in and of themselves, but further, I wanted them to take specific note from those stories of the actions that ordinary human beings had actually taken in response to injustice and violence. I wanted them to feel empowered by the ordinariness of the doers and their acts, so to speak, and come to believe that we are all capable of taking action against injustice. Continuing to share acts of co-witnessing as we've been doing during the term could help us create a large repertoire of possible actions we could take if we ever found ourselves trying to co-witness to a similar situation. On the 11th of August, 2019, we launched a Facebook group called Doing Something. It didn't spread virally, as on some level I hoped it might, but it has grown in spurts to about 200 members, and it's been active essentially continuously since that date. And please join if you're on Facebook and you care to. Most of the posts are transmissions, the passing on of other people's co-witnessing to an important injustice or corrective to an injustice. In May 2020, for example, I reposted a New York Times article about the Irish raising millions of dollars to help the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Reservation pay for water, health supplies, and COVID-19 testing in that early period of the pandemic. Like Hank Zanoli and Tessa Oos, the Irish connected their action to more than one historical time period. In this case, they announced their donation as a way of acknowledging and thanking the Choctaw tribe that had sent money in 1847 to their ancestors suffering from the potato famine, a time when tribal members themselves had just been forcibly relocated, thousands dying along the Trail of Tears. Now, that New York Times article didn't use the term co-witnessing, of course, but I named both sets of actions co-witnessing, to which Doing Something group members could in turn co-witness by repeating the story of the contemporary and historical injustices and remediations involved. So to return to my initial mention of Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Me Too, and even the invasion of the Ukraine, many Doing Something posts constitute a first or an early co-witnessing to what ordinary people are doing right now to respond to war, racial inequality, health and hunger crises unleashed by police violence, the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the failed policies of governments. For instance, in summer 2020, a member posted a photo of her and her neighbors standing in the middle of a busy traffic circle with signs protesting the tearing down of another neighbor's Black Lives Matter sign. Another member shared a story about one of his neighbors donating a large plot of land to the descendants of those indigenous people from whom it most likely had been stolen centuries prior. We co-witness when we pass on stories of these actions, small and large, connecting them to racial injustice, poverty, genocide as appropriate. Group members agree that doing something to improve our relations with each other and the natural environment is urgent. Doing Something has become a virtual community that spreads hope by documenting and often taking action, inspiring me to add one additional bullet point to my description of the co-witness. The co-witness learns from historical and contemporary co-witnesses what actions might be taken to rectify injustices or to prevent them from happening in the first place, or from continuing to happen, and then takes those actions when appropriate and possible. To my mind, Doing Something is a worthwhile evolution of originally strictly academic work. Thank you for your kind attention. I am eager to learn what's on your minds.
While we finish our little technical rearranging here, I'm going to just go ahead and ask you the first question. First question is, what responsibility do we have to check the accuracy of the events we co-witness?
Huge. I guess I have to put this on. We have a huge responsibility to check the historical accuracy. That process is not something I was able to outline with you here tonight, but all the examples I gave, I had spent a lot of time checking from multiple sources, of course, before I pass them on to you, for example, okay? So as we know, in our society, historical accuracy has become really, I feel like, almost a danger to our existence, lack of historical accuracy. So it's very, very important. Yep.
Thank you for that. Can co-witnessing ever lead to negative consequences?
To negative consequences? Well, yeah, for sure, it could. One of the examples is with Zanoli, who received a lot of criticism that he had criticized the Israelis. And that's something that we're seeing going on right now in the world, right? And it's even at the level of the UN. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to this issue of a particular definition of anti-Semitism that's been urged by the Israeli government to be adopted by many countries, and now the UN is being urged to adopt that definition. And many scholars who are specialists in this field, including myself, have protested that, and we have done so publicly, right? So, but in any case, criticism of the Israeli government has come to stand as some kind of blanket anti-Semitism, which I think those two things have to really be separated out. So Zanoli received terrible criticism of doing what he did so publicly, and he stood up under the fire, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we'll just move to the, okay.
Try to put this here.
I kept this on maybe. It's easier than you can, if we don't get feedback anyway.
Okay. Can everybody hear all right?
Great.
Okay. All right, that's better. All right, so first of all, thank you so much for coming.
you.
That was really, really engaging. I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, is this better? I wanted to ask what you think about how, you sort of started discussing this when you mentioned the Facebook group that you and your students started. Can you say something about social media and its role as a sort of positive tool, but also as a sort of something as a tool that gets misused, where things get appropriated? I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. So I'm not that experienced in social media. I am on Facebook, but I don't use it very much other than now this Doing Something group. So I wasn't that experienced with it. And of course, I read the newspaper, so I know that that social media gets abused. I understand what going viral can mean. One member, let me take the example that has to do with me. At the beginning of the pandemic, you might remember that people were offering wisdom about how you can tell whether you have COVID or not. And one of those particular self-tests, struck me as really helpful, and it was supposedly came from a Stanford doctor. And I posted it. And then immediately I was told by other members in the group that that was completely bogus. And then, I apologized and took it down. So I think when people mean well and they think it's urgent, with very good intention, you can pass on information that's actually not correct. So I think we see both, right? I heard it, I posted it, it was wrong, I was corrected very quickly, and it disappeared. But sometimes things get going, they take on a life of their own. We've also had disagreements. Some of you might remember that Jonathan Franzen had posted something about why we should accept that we're already doomed in terms of climate crisis. And someone else in the group really felt that that was very, very discouraging and that it was not helpful to spread that around. So we've had, not often, but we've had a few debates. I do think that each of us has to be responsible about what we choose to list on our Facebook pages or whatever medium you use, and to check the accuracy of it and to be wary of what the effect might be. So there are lots and lots of negative effects of social media. I don't think I actually need to go into that, but would those examples answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I just was thinking about things like the Arab Spring, for example. Gosh, there's so many current examples of how it was used as a very powerful tool to sort of record what's happening and pass it on, and you can pass it on. And so it's a very lightning fast form of co-witnessing if it's done in a certain way.
Yes.
Which I found interesting as I was listening to you talk. In line with that, someone has asked a question. Your Facebook group, Do Something, reminds me of a group Jane Goodall has pioneered of young people whom she has inspired. She calls this Roots and Shoots, which aims to inspire, empower, and encourage young people all over the world. So it's really more of a statement than a question.
Yeah, that's great. I'm all for spreading information, so thank you about that. No, the more of these groups we have, because not all of them are going to appeal to everyone, or not everyone's going to hear about every group. I would say that with Doing Something, we did have a discussion about whether it should be an open group or a closed group, and we decided to close it specifically because of wanting to discourage trolling, and that's in the guidelines for people who join the group. So so there's one question, is how did you learn about this, right? So if you give me a legitimate answer about how you learned about it, I let you in. So it's not like we're really filtering people, but there have been some times where something about the profile just struck me as very strange, and I didn't let someone in. So you can have an opinion about that, but it was an attempt to have a safe space where people felt that they could ask questions in addition to just receive information. And we also had a lot of, we had some Russians in the group, one of whom was very offended by some information I posted as a good resource for finding out what was going on at the beginning of the war. And I still think that was a good source, but there was no point in offending. That was not what I was trying to do, so I actually took down that reference. So I think I lost the thread, though, on your question. Did I?
Nope,
you were just mentioning about another wonderful group.
Absolutely,
yeah.
no,
Okay.
we're just chatting. Okay, so there is another question here. I wonder how you conceive of loss. The idea of co-witnessing seems a kind of bulwark against loss, remembering what has been forgotten, building up the story. But what about the loss that has been lost? What about the loss that has been lost? Does co-witnessing admit of it?
Okay, that's a beautifully written question. Thank you, whoever that was. I think that, first of all, there's a whole piece about how I developed this idea from trauma theory that I just didn't have time to really share with all of you. But I think if you are directly yourself in the presence of a person who's had a major loss, whether it's the loss of an individual who was very beloved, or the loss of a limb, the loss of a relationship, I think there's a way, as a human being, there's a kind of gentleness that begins with what I mentioned before, deciding to listen to someone else, and then deciding to express sadness about the way that person is feeling. So those kinds of things are very, very important when we're dealing with a direct interpersonal interaction, right? It's a little different when you're interacting with a book or a movie, but I think that when you're in the presence of a person, we have to be very, very careful, because nothing will replace the loss. And that's very important to be clear about. So the co-witnessing doesn't fill in the hole, it points at the hole. It points at the hole. And how we do that is important. I mean, one of the reasons I like to talk about Modiano's book, and if you don't know it, it is available. It was originally written in French, but there's a very good English translation. And I encourage you strongly, it's a very short book. But one of the reasons I love that book is because it's just beautifully written. You know, it's beautifully written. And I think the beauty is part of the gentleness of acknowledging this young girl who was full of life. I mean, she ran away from home because she was full of life. She had her own ideas, you know. They put her in a Catholic school to try to protect her, and she hated it, you know. So she ran away twice. She was in occupied Paris twice for months, you know, hiding somehow. So at the end of the book, I had that in the talk, and I just had to cut it out. It was too long, but since you're still sitting here, I'll mention it. The very end of the book is this beautiful evocation, acknowledging what he doesn't know about what she did, and that it's really good that she has her own secrets. You know, he sort of says, he like restores agency to her by saying, those are your secrets, and you will keep them forever, you know. And then he uses second person address at the end of that passage, which I think is a way of, again, connecting with her, right? Martin Buber, I and thou, you know, but also making the reader feel like you have an obligation in this, right? So, so I think beauty is a response, can be a response to loss, and not all of us are capable of creating beauty, but I think we're all capable of feeling pain, and so we can, without, now this is a really good example of not appropriating. And this is hard for a lot of us, and it's hard for me. I hope I haven't offended anyone in the audience in this way. Because sometimes to show solidarity, we say, oh, I know just what you mean, right? I am prone to that statement. And no, you don't. You actually don't, right? So being able to say, I see how sad you are. I can imagine that that is a huge loss. Would you like me to just sit here with you in the presence of this loss, right? Is different than saying, I know just what you mean, or, you know, you'll have another child, right, to a woman who's just lost a child, or a father who's just lost a child, right? No, maybe you will have another child, which will be a beautiful thing, but it's not going to erase the loss of the child that you lost, right? So, yeah, great.
What that reminded me of, actually, I remember I was in, as a graduate student, I studied with Elie Wiesel, and I remember him talking once about the important, how you listen to someone's trauma, like the way to do it. And I think that, you know, he in so many words said, you just need to be present. Just be there. Don't you know, don't put the person who's telling their story in the position of having to comfort you because, you know, oh, I'm so traumatized by your trauma.
Right.
Right, because then it becomes like not about them.
Exactly.
And that the ability to just sit and be present and hold it, right? And I think what really resonated with me personally and professionally was the value of, you know, another person's vision of a trauma, your trauma, in making it a story. It's not this amorphous thing that I can't talk about and that like is sharp and hurts, right? And so that's what you were, when you were talking about Dora Bruder there, and the way that he was trying to sort of humanize it, that's where my mind went.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We have another question here. As a trauma psychologist, I've come to think that we humans have an instinct for justice. I love this. To pursue it, we cannot rest until the instinct is satisfied. That instinct emerges in children as they know and demand fairness. Comment. So I think just, what do you think of that?
I don't find anything I would disagree with. I mean, and I do think children often have a very strong sense of justice. It's a little bit coincidental. I told you that this was not planned as a November 9th lecture. Similarly, I didn't plan to be doing 3 professional things in very close amount of time. But 1 week from today, I'll be speaking at the University of Massachusetts. And the focus of that talk is actually a very powerful memoir by Ruth Kluger called Still Alive in the English translation, Weiterleben in German. And she was very young. She was born in 1931. So she was very young when she and her mother were deported to Theresienstadt. But as a child, she had a huge sense of injustice. And she gives example after example of what was unjust in what was going on around her and to her, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another, I don't think it's on the list of the handout just because I wasn't working with it today in this talk, but it's a very powerful memoir for children and sense of justice, yeah.
Thank you for that. So there's another question here, which I think brings us back to social media. Does a repost ignore emotional internalization as an event? Isn't our ability to feel an event as though it has happened to ourselves key in co-witnessing? I may be misinterpreting, but it seems as though this idea of co-witnesses must remain detached. Tell me the story, I don't feel the story, if that makes sense. So I guess the question is around what's the role of affect? Is there, and is part of effective co-witnessing allowing, like putting yourself in the person's shoes, at least internally? I think that's the question, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I think I discern a few different issues in that question, so let me see if I can respond to a few of them. First of all, doing something, even though it came very much out of this idea of co-witnessing that I had shared with the students, it has a more limited aim. So it really is focusing, and it kind of developed, right? The first few posts were very philosophical and theoretical and this and that. And then that wasn't what people were looking for. They actually just wanted to hear about people who had done good things or organizations that were doing good things or, so that's got a more limited aim, I would say, although again, sometimes emotions are, I just posted something the other day about Lois Curtis. She just passed away. I don't normally post obituaries, but she was an advocate for disability rights and specifically for people with disabilities to be able to live on their own and die at home. She had been in institutions for most of her life and she wanted to have her own home before she died. And I was so moved by this story and I was so embarrassed and sad that I didn't know about her that I put it there. So sometimes it's just getting it out there and letting people know this exists, this organization exists. We've talked a lot about police departments, and so we've shared what different police departments in different places have done or different communities have done about their police departments. So civilian oversight boards, right? Some of you might know that the Civilian Oversight Board in New York City just got the right to actually recommend punishment for those who are found guilty, which was not part of their original mandate. So Ithaca, New York, they're running the police department. The civilians are running the police department. So we try to share information there. In terms of one's own affect, I appreciate that this comment question came up because the book that I wrote, Daddy's War, it's a long process. It's a very hybrid kind of book. But the last section, which is the second longest section, is a letter to my father. And in that letter, I try to tell him his story. This is sort of the first purest on some level example of co-witnessing. I tried to recreate what had happened to him in the war and name the emotions. So for example, the very little that he told me, sometimes he would start laughing about things that were not funny. My husband, that was an interesting slip. Okay, no, no, luckily not my husband. But my father, unfortunately, was probably tortured at some point by some kind of Nazi official. And he either wouldn't talk about it or he would laugh, you know? And I was like, given where that scar is, it must have hurt like hell, you know? So that's me sort of saying, you know, imagining how much pain it was. Or he was also very young. He was born in 1929. And he was arrested at some point for gleaning olives, right? His family had nothing to eat, and his brother went and picked up olives. So they were thrown in a little local prison. And it must have traumatized him because his father at some point before the war had tried to cure him by making him spend a night in jail. And he was, you know, 6 years old when that first event happened. And then he was arrested for being circumcised, right? So, so that rearrest, you know, must have terrified him. And I didn't pick up on that soon enough in the interviewing process. And when I re-listened to the tape, I heard him say, I wasn't very much in this specific region of Greece, which is where the rest of his family was, for fear of being rearrested. And I hadn't heard that the first time. I hadn't heard the rearrested. It's like, oh my God, he really was arrested a different time, right? So saying how scary that must have been, or he had a very dramatic, I recommend chapter 5. If you don't want to read the rest of the book, give chapter 5. It's really an incredible story what happened, especially the ending, because at a certain point he was in Athens, hiding under a bed. The building across the street had just been blown up, and the British were trying to get into the room where he was, and they kicked down the door. And at the moment that they kicked down the door, he jumped out from underneath the bed, he threw up his arms, and he screamed in English, which he barely remembered at that stage, I'm American, don't shoot, you know? And, you know, I mean, he was 13 years old, you know? So just putting the emotion to that and saying, Dad, you know, that must have been scary to all but Jesus, you know? So it is about affect. It's about putting the correct affect. But in that case, it's me trying to imagine what his affect has been. There are parts where I talk about my affect. You know, I talk about what it did to me to live with a father who couldn't talk about his traumas. You know, but even that, I do try to hold it in check because, yeah, it's about me. I wrote the book, right? So I'm trying to help him understand why I was traumatized. But ultimately, we have to tread very carefully with emotions in general. They're very, very powerful. They're not good or bad. They're very powerful. So, sorry, long answer to
No, that was perfect. I just wanted to, it sounds a lot like, what I think is effective is I think in therapeutic terms would be called reflective listening. You know, I see, I hear, you know, I understood that you just said, and I think that there is a way that helps to organize, you know, the victim's experience for them also, right? So, yeah, that's interesting. Let's see, I believe, out of time. Okay, excellent.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome. Thank all of
We could
you
have
so
just
much.
kept going.
Okay, we could have kept going, but I do want to just say thank you so much for being here in person. It really means a lot to me. Thank you. Yeah, great.